This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for our new report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation Series, Utility Investment in Resilience of Electricity Systems. The report authors are representatives of utilities, states, and consumer advocates, and they'll each have 15 minutes to present their perspectives on this topic. And then we'll take questions from the audience. But first, I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you about the report series and go over the logistics for today. First, the series of reports is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policymakers, and the electricity industry. The series uses a multiple perspectives format to present different views on the future of utility regulation and business models. And there are some trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds the series, and an advisory group helps prioritize what topics we cover, provides guidance on how we cover them, and reviews the draft report. Members include representatives of utilities, public utility commissions, consumer advocates, and other experts, and we thank them for their assistance. We've completed 11 reports so far in the series. Our next report coming up will address utility renewable energy options for large customers like cities and corporations. Before I turn over the mic for today's presentations, here are a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website. And because of a large number of participants today in the webinar, everyone is in listen mode only, so please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter your questions at any time and we'll answer as many as we can following the presentations. You may want to direct your question to a specific author. The report authors, again, will each have 15 minutes to present, and then I'll moderate the Q&A with the authors. The report and our webinar slides are posted at the website shown here, and following this webinar, we'll post a recording of it. So we have 4 presenters today, starting with Lauren Azar, who's currently an attorney in private practice. Lauren earlier served as a public utility commissioner in Wisconsin and as a senior advisor at U.S. Department of Energy. She provided technical assistance to the organization of MISO states to develop its essay for this report. The organization includes representatives from each of the 17 regulatory bodies that have retail jurisdiction over entities participating in MISO. Next, Randy Elliott, who is regulatory counsel for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. He's responsible for matters at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for NR ECA. He previously was regulatory counsel for the American Public Power Association and an attorney at FERC. Next, we have Scott Aaronson, Vice President of Security and Preparedness for Edison Electric Institute. He leads work on cyber and physical security, storm response and recovery, and all kinds of related regulatory policy. He's also Secretary for the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, which serves as the primary liaison between government senior officials and electric industry leaders. And last but not least is Rob Mork, who chairs the Electricity Committee of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. Rob led a subcommittee of interested members to draft NASUCA's perspective for this report. Rob has served the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counsel since 2000 as Deputy Consumer Counselor for Federal Affairs. He also serves as president of the Consumer Advocates of PJM States and is on the MISO Advisory Committee. So let's drill down to the report. The report covers 5 questions. What level and scope of resilience do we need? How much are we willing to pay? Who's responsible? And how should other entities coordinate with those responsible parties where there are mutual benefits? What kinds of investments have the most impact on improving resilience? And how can utilities and regulators tell whether investments in resilience are actually impactful? Should utilities take more proactive approaches? And how can decision-making about resilience investments be improved? So following presentations, we'll respond to your questions that you put in the chat box, so please enter your questions at any time. Let's begin our presentations. Lauren?
Thank you, Lisa. As she mentioned, I am representing the organization of MISO states, which is the 17 regulatory bodies within MISO. I wanted to start off with a caveat because, as you know, regulators do not and cannot be pre-decisional. As a result, nothing in our report or today's presentation reflects any specific LMS member unless they are specifically mentioned. All the ideas are preliminary or conceptual, and regulators' positions may change over time. We'll also note, if you read the report, that not every one of the regulatory bodies endorsed the report, and you can check out footnote 1, which describes who signed on and who did not. The regulators were also very specific that they wanted to focus on areas within state jurisdiction, specifically the distribution system and not the bulk power system. So with that, one of our first orders of business, of course, was defining resilience. And as everybody I think knows, there's no industry-approved definition of resilience. And after a robust discussion amongst the regulators, we essentially came up with 3 different buckets of where the regulators were on what resilience was vis-a-vis reliability. Some regulators believe reliability and resilience are exactly the same thing, and there's no reason actually to talk about resilience. We can have the discussions we need when just talking about reliability. Others believe that resilience is a subset of reliability. And the third set is that resilience and reliability are different but related. For those regulators that agreed that there was some distinction between resilience and reliability, they agreed that the differentiator was the frequency and the magnitude of the event. And if you take a look at the continuum on the screen, we've got low impact, high frequency events on the left-hand side, which are reliability events, and on the right-hand side, we've got the high impact, low frequency events, which I'll call HILF events. And those are, of course, our resilience events. In the middle, we've got the major event days, or I'll call those MEDs, and it's unclear whether a major event day falls within the reliability bucket or the resilience bucket. But for today's talk, as well as for the OMS chapter, we assumed that major event days did fall within the resilience bucket. So we did have to come up with a definition of resilience to write the report, and the regulators agreed to use something like the FERC definition, which is broken out into 3 temporal phases of an event. Specifically before the event, the ability to prevent or minimize impacts. During the event, the ability to respond and adapt, and after the event, the ability to restore functionality. So LBNL, one of the questions that they wanted us to answer was just how much resilience is needed. As everybody knows, we don't have resilience standards. And as the regulators talked about it, the conclusion was there could be no generic answer on behalf of the regulators because each had unique circumstances. As you may know, the MISO footprint extends from Texas to Manitoba, Indiana to Montana, and as you can probably guess, they have very different potential HILF events, as North Dakota, for instance, was talking about blizzards, and the states in the south about hurricanes. In addition to different types of HILF events, they also have different types of critical infrastructure, which, as we will discuss later, is a large component of evaluating proposed resilience improvements. Each state had, different sizes and types of military bases. Some of them had a lot of telecommunication services and servers. Others had regional hospitals. So being able to identify the critical infrastructure, again, was a unique evaluation for each state. And lastly, as far as prioritizing which resilience investments one should take, they indicated that they really needed to talk with a larger number of stakeholders to determine what their priorities would be. For example, would you prioritize, protecting a communication system over a fuel dispensary or a hospital over a fire station? They all indicated that it was quite fact-specific and unique to their state, so there was no generic answer. So how does one decide what type of resilience improvements a state should take, or a regulatory body should take, or approve, I should say? And so when we focused on resilience planning, they indicated that there are really two different ways in which this issue will come up before the regulatory body. One is the utility either proposes or seeks cost recovery after it has already done the investment. Or the regulatory body can initiate a rulemaking or generic docket. And for those states that believe resilience and reliability are not the same thing, of course, we don't have a standard for resilience, so there must be a different kind of process through which they evaluate proposed investments or evaluate investments after they've been made. And those states indicated they do use risk analyses and a cost-benefit analysis to make those evaluations. And the slide before you explains hopefully what most people understand are risk analyses and cost-benefit analyses. The first is you determine the probability of the event. The second is you're essentially determining the probability and magnitude of the consequences. And so to do that, to determine what the consequences are, what's the likelihood of them happening, you first have to identify the critical infrastructure and resources that are going to be potentially impacted. And then you've got to ID the impact on that infrastructure and those resources. The next step is determining how much it will cost to build the proposed improvement or to initiate the response steps. And you then evaluate how that proposed improvement or investment will reduce the probability of the consequences or minimize the magnitude of the consequences. Then you switch to the cost-benefit analysis, and you determine how much it's going to cost to do the proposed improvement. And I just want to emphasize that resilience improvements do include response, adaptation, and recovery, even though I will periodically slip up and just refer to infrastructure. But it does include response, adaptation, and recovery, which are sometimes human activities. The next, you determine how cost-effective the investment is. And to do that, you've got to evaluate the scope of the damage that's being monetized. So if you're determining, you're going to minimize the magnitude of consequences. Well, how much money are you going to save if you minimize those consequences? For instance, are you only looking at the consequences of a loss of electricity service? Or are you also looking at how a loss of electricity service cascades into other sectors, such as telecommunications and water? Are you looking at economy-wide damages? As you can imagine, as the scope of the cost-benefit analysis, the damage analysis expands, the more expensive of a resilient investment you can justify. All right, so what are the challenges of infrastructure planning and response and adaptation planning? First of all, the scope is sometimes difficult because utilities, if they are conducting it, can only develop plans within their control. They, for instance, can't address failure in other sectors, widespread damage that goes beyond their service territories or the Commission's jurisdiction. And they also have sometimes difficulties identifying or developing plans that would address supply chain issues that are outside their control. Also, we've got the uncertainty of needs. As you can imagine, since we're dealing with probability events, the probability of the event happening, the probability of the event causing certain damages, we've got probability across two different vectors, which makes the evaluation difficult. And we also have multiple changing variables in the analysis. So both of those, the changing variables and the probability analysis across at least two vectors makes it difficult. And lastly, cost allocation is a challenge. As many know, regulators usually allocate costs to those that benefit from the investment. But in this situation, benefits can accrue across sectors, across a number of utilities, across communities, and frankly across areas where the regulators have no jurisdiction. And so it's difficult to allocate costs across areas where you have no control. So given all that, just generically, what could be the most impactful investments? Again, I want to stress that the regulators were focusing on the distribution system, and they did note that most outages were caused by the distribution system. They also concluded that the more events covered, the greater the cost effectiveness of the proposed investment. And of course, event-agnostic investments may be the most impactful. And examples of event-agnostic investments could include self-healing grids, mobile substations, response protocols, microgrids, and demand response with an interruptible tariffs. And if you're not event-agnostic, if you're actually looking at events, the more events that you are addressing with a single investment, the likelihood that it's going to be more cost effective. So if you can assist with multiple health events versus just one, you're likely to be more impactful. And for those states that distinguish between reliability and resilience, they noted that, of course, if an improvement actually bolsters both reliability and resilience, it's likely more cost effective and more impactful. And lastly, just another reminder that response, adaptation, and recovery, those oftentimes apply to, I'm not sure I can say all events, but to many events, and therefore dealing with response, adaptation, and recovery may be, certainly falls into the category of impactful investments. All right. So the states have taken a number of initiatives that cover resilience, and there were two different categories. There were broad initiatives and there were targeted initiatives. Under the broad initiatives, and these were initiatives that addressed both resilience and reliability. We've got a number of examples in the report, and I'm just going to mention a few here. So Michigan initiated a risk-based distribution planning to harden their networks. Indiana, they enacted a new statute that allows utilities to submit a plan to upgrade infrastructure over a 7-year time period. Minnesota, in 2016, their staff released a report with 5 guiding principles for grid modernization, including distribution planning. And some of the states noted that their broad-based initiatives actually are grounded in their enabling statute for safe and reliable supply of electricity. As far as initiatives that are targeted strictly to resilience, the only one that we discussed explicitly was cybersecurity. And Wisconsin, as an example, created a cyber disruption response strategy among many stakeholders, including governmental entities as well as the private sector. So how does one improve resilience decision-making? This was one of the questions LBNL explicitly discussed. And as we know, the threats against utilities actually are constantly changing. And so the regulators noted that if they have a regular process for evaluating the changing threats as well as potentially investments that could mitigate those threats, would be an important step to take. And the process in that situation may be as important as the results. They also noted that being able to evaluate the effectiveness of investments that were installed for purposes of resilience, if you're identifying resilience as separate from reliability, would be helpful. And the ability to create feedback loops, so after a specific investment was installed, determine how effective it has been against the threats that were identified. They also identified that state commissions only have access usually to in-state information. So data access is an issue, and the ability to get data on, for instance, out-of-state threats would be helpful. I can tell you the regulators really, can I just say really, like the regional and multi-sector exercises that happen like GridX. And lastly, the regulators indicated that it would be helpful for them to share best practices since this is such an emerging area. that they thought, why don't we figure out a way in which we can share what we're doing vis-a-vis the threats. And examples are, how are utilities evaluating risk for health events, reporting requirements for the major event days, common questions that regulators could ask utilities and do ask utilities, and once again holding not only interstate exercises, but some states hold intrastate exercises amongst the various sectors. And so as far as best practice goes, how one goes about holding those intrastate exercises among sectors. And that is it. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thanks, Lauren. So next up, we have Randy Elliott, and just a reminder that you should submit any questions that you have for our presenters today in the chat box, and I will moderate the Q&A discussion at the end of this webinar. Randy?
Thank you, Lisa. So, NRECA's essay in this report looks at the 5 questions from the perspective of rural electric cooperatives. And I guess I should put a similar disclaimer in my statements. These are the report's prepared by NRECA staff and does not necessarily represent the position of any of our nearly 900 members. I'm sure who would be quick to remind me of that fact. I've included a few statistics here on the first slide just to tell you and illustrate why the resilience investment discussions are important for cooperatives. Cooperatives serve about 56% of the nation's land mass, if you looked at a map. And in order to reach our member consumers, we own and maintain about 42% of the nation's electric distribution lines. And those lines reach 20 million homes, businesses, schools, and farms in 47 states, and 88% of the U.S.'s counties, and serve about 42 million people. There are about a little, almost 900 cooperatives in the country. So the question that that came up in Lauren's discussion is, what is resilience, and how is it different than reliability? Unlike reliability, there really is no universal established definition of resilience or any established metrics for judging the performance of an electric system. FERC, in its January 2018 order rejecting the DOE resiliency pricing proposal, proposed this definition of resilience that you see on the screen there, which itself is based upon prior federal government and industry efforts to come up with a definition. And that's a fairly established way of the industry is looking at it now. But again, it has no legal force or effect. For purposes of our essay, NRECA just developed a working definition that you see there, the ability to maintain normal or near normal service or status through planning, prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery efforts. And that implies several important principles that guide our essay here. The focus, first of all, is on end-use consumers, the cooperative's members. The goal here is resilient service to them, not resilient assets or infrastructure. So decisions on investment should be driven by the consequences for end-use consumers, including cost. For electric cooperatives, this perspective is in keeping with their ultimate purpose of providing safe, affordable, reliable electric service to their consumer members. A second important principle is that it looks beyond resilience, is more than just infrastructure. It involves people, processes, organization, coordination, emergency response, the ability to respond, survive, and learn, adapt to events that interrupt service. So it's more than just investing in hardened infrastructure. It also involves assessing the human and economic consequences of an outage, as Lauren has described some of this, and the ability to survive an event and ensure vital public services during an event is also part of resilience planning by a cooperative. I gave an example of a cooperative in California needing to bring in emergency generation in order to provide some essential services while a transmission line was restored after a wildfire in California last year. It's an example of that kind of survival mode that may be important in planning. And that utility is now looking at installing more solar and battery resources on their distribution system to enable them to better survive an event such as that in the future. So from our perspective, resilience is broader than just reliability, and there's not a bright line distinction, and there's some overlap. But from our perspective, it involves more than just the standard measures of reliability in either at the bulk power system or at the distribution level. And as Lauren also described, the focus in resilience is more on those black sky, high impact, low frequency events than ordinary risks that are the matters of ordinary reliability analysis. And for co-ops, the key to resilience investment decision making is local planning and local decision making. As load-serving entities with a legal obligation to serve their consumer members, cooperatives have to engage in long-term planning to manage the risks and optimize their systems and their operations to meet their obligations to serve their consumer members. So the first of the 5 questions then was, how much resilience do we need? What's the scope of resilience risks we're insuring against? How much insurance do we buy? So those sorts of the co-op's perspective of long-term planning at the local level, really leads into the answer to those questions. So resilience-enhancing investments will be part of a cooperative's long-term resource planning and investment decisions driven by the needs of the cooperative's consumer members. This local planning process allows a cooperative to balance reliability, resilience, cost, and other objectives in optimizing their investment decisions. And this enables them to make the most effective, cost-effective resilience investments with a long-term perspective. Now, the literature of resilience generally describes resilience in terms of specific kinds of risks, and we've listed some of them in our report. These range from historical risks, natural disasters, to emerging risks like cyber attacks, weather-related, and as well as sabotage, and all sorts of risks. So insuring against these risks is necessarily a complicated endeavor, because different causes, different risks require different kinds of preparation and have different consequences also. So the consensus recommendation in the literature and in reports that we've reviewed is to take that all hazards or multi-hazard approach to resilience by developing a portfolio of responses to multiple hazards and trying to meet the risks that way, recognizing that you will never protect yourself completely, and therefore will have to have plans for response, recovery, and learning from that over time. So we believe that cooperatives are well positioned to use the data and information they get from operating their system to drive investment decisions, particularly at the distribution level. Cooperatives are developing new analytic tools to harness the data, the new kinds of data that advanced metering and other technologies are providing, in order to optimize their investment decisions at the distribution level. So there are various, and cooperatives are not alone in that. I mean, efforts are underway to formalize utility decision processes in the industry at large. And as Lauren described, they generally use some method of cost-benefit analysis. And cooperatives are attempting to do that as well, using improved analytical methodologies and better data as that evolves over time. So the question then posed in the report is who's responsible for resilience? How do entities coordinate with utilities when there are mutual benefits? And responsibility really is widely for resilience, given its broad nature of the term resilience, is widely dispersed among many private and public entities throughout the country. And our essay attempted to list some of the entities just to give an idea of the scope of shared responsibility for resilience of the electric power system in the country. Given that dispersed responsibility, it's important that matters don't fall through the cracks, but we don't see that dispersed responsibility as necessarily being a bad thing, in that it enables different entities to harness their knowledge and expertise for the benefit of the overall public interest in providing a resilient electric power system. You could dub that strength through diversity. Of course, that requires coordination. It requires entities electric utilities to coordinate with other utilities, and also to coordinate with other entities, including their local communities in planning and emergency response and other activities. As an example, electric utilities and local public safety authorities need to coordinate on matters such as who's responsible for clearing down trees after a storm. For instance, a downed tree could prevent access to critical electric infrastructure like a substation or a power plant. And the question may be who's supposed to be removing that tree. But then there are other well-established coordination efforts, including such things as GridX that Lauren referred to, the EISAC and the ESCC, which I think Scott will be talking about later, local and emergency preparedness drills, mutual aid arrangements, including physical mutual assistance after storms, as well as more recently the establishment of mechanisms for cyber mutual assistance after cyber events. Equipment sharing, such as critical transformers and other equipment, is also an established practice in the utility industry and aids in providing resilient service. I would say that with the evolution of the grid, the needs for coordination are growing. If we're going to have new technologies and distributed energy resources being integrated into distribution systems by other entities besides the utility, that can affect the safety and the reliability and resilience and security of the distribution systems. And so distribution utilities need visibility of those resources. They need to coordinate with the owners of those resources. And they need to invest in infrastructure such as communications networks, sensors, and other new equipment to leverage the capabilities of these resources to maximize the potential benefits for the entire system. And that also requires more coordination, as I said, with the owners and operators of these new resources and technologies on distribution systems. So what kinds of utility investments have the most impact on improving resilience? Well, as we noted in the report, there are many types of potential investments that a utility, including a cooperative, could contemplate to enhance the resilience of service to its customers, or in our case, to our members. These range from investments at the transmission level to the distribution level, the generation level, and also investments in infrastructure as well as investments in new processes and communications procedures and response and recovery efforts. It's the decision of where to put your limited investment money is a complicated one necessarily. But from our perspective, it's best driven in most instances by local decision making, driven by local circumstances, because so many of these risks will be unique to a particular utility or to a particular area. The report also posed the question of how do you evaluate the effectiveness of resilience investments, and that remains a difficult thing to do because of the low frequency of many of the risks that you're insuring against, which provides little historical experience or data on which to draw. So with that limitation, nonetheless, there are some general conclusions that appear that one can draw from past data and experience on how best to enhance resilience. The low-hanging fruit, if you will. And one of those would be upgrading and maintaining distribution systems to reduce their vulnerability to weather-related failures. That's likely to be a cost-effective way to enhance resilience, because at this point the data shows that most power outages occur because of problems at the distribution level, not at the bulk power transmission level. And weather is the biggest contributor to outages. So working on such mundane matters as pole maintenance and vegetation management is likely to be a cost-effective way of ensuring more resilient service. And a second factor that we've noted is maintaining a balanced portfolio of resources, of generating resources, and both at the bulk power level as well as at the distribution level. This is a frequent topic of discussion at FERC and in discussions there about essential reliability services, fuel security, and matters like that. But I think it would also be a relevant factor at the distribution level with the modernization of the grid and the deployment of distributed energy resources. Maintaining a balance of resources and control technologies at the distribution level will become increasingly important in the future. And a third point we noted is in the report is this cybersecurity investment is going to continue to be important given the rapid evolution of the risks and the threats themselves, as well as the evolution of the grid, which is providing more points for cyber intrusion into the electric power system. So those are three areas that seem to be pretty consensus areas for investment right now to ensure resilient service. The report also asked whether utilities should take a more proactive approach to investment, and we think the answer is a resounding yes, that electric utilities, including cooperatives, should take a more proactive approaches because they're usually in the best position to make critical decisions on investments to enhance the resilience. At this point, there appears to be no superior way to make these investment decisions than through the traditional process that Lauren noted of planning and cost-benefit analysis overseen by appropriate state and local regulators. We believe that electric cooperatives are well positioned to make resilience investment decisions given their close relationship with the communities that they serve. In short, resilience can and should be a component of all utility investment decision making. The final question posed in the report was how can resilience investment decision making be improved? Given the lack of any clear definitions and measurement criteria at this point, we believe that efforts led by industry or the government to develop consensus agreement on better definitions of resilience and criteria for measuring resilience and performance criteria would be of benefit to the entire industry. The objective here would not be uniform nationwide top-down resilience standards, resembling what NERC does on the reliability side, but rather analytical tools and metrics such as the industry is often used in the reliability area to provide performance measurements and to improve bottom-up planning, coordination, decision-making by regional authorities, RTOs, by state and local regulators, by utilities, and by local communities. A related problem, though, is not just the definitions and criteria, but the availability of data. And I think we're optimistic that over time, with advanced metering and other technologies, that the availability of data for measuring and assessing resilience is likely to improve. But that is a continuing problem at this point as well. If we get better data and better analytical tools, we can have more rigorous cost-benefit analysis by utilities and regulators, and that would assist in resilience investment decision-making. It would also improve communication with regulators and communities about resilience issues. In other words, the ability of utilities to communicate with stakeholders about their resilience decision-making in order to justify the prudence of the decisions or just the common sense to their community. You can envision the benefits of this at all different levels of the industry. At the distribution level, better, more rigorous cost-benefit analysis would improve distribution planning at the local level and optimize investment decisions there. At the transmission level, you could imagine the ability to quantify costs and benefits of resilience measures could be factored into transmission planning and the fashioning even of non-transmission alternatives as part of the FERC Order Number 1000 interregional transmission planning process. At the wholesale market level, if we are able to develop resilience definitions and metrics that would enable wholesale markets to incorporate resilience into wholesale market products, services, and prices, that would provide investment decision signals, price signals, to the industry. But at this point, efforts to incorporate resilience into wholesale market pricing is really only at the we're only making baby steps in that direction at this point. But that is obviously a topic for discussion at FERC and in the RTOs. And with that, I think I've concluded the summary of the basic points in our report, and I'll turn it over back to Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. So next up, we have Scott Aaronson with Edison Electric Institute. You just heard the perspective of the National Electric Cooperative Association, and now we'll hear a perspective from the investor-owned utility organization. I want to remind everyone that you should submit your questions and comments through the chat box, and I'll be moderating Q&A with the presenters shortly. Scott?
Thanks for that, Lisa. So hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Scott Aaronson. I lead EEI Security and Preparedness Group, but also serve as part of the Secretariat for the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, or ESCC. I'll talk about that in more detail, but I think one of the important things is you're going to hear a lot of the same themes that you heard from both Lauren and Randy from me. I'll package them slightly differently, though, with more of a national security perspective. And the other aspect of the Sector Coordinating Council, while EEI represents all of the nation's investor-owned electric companies, the ESCC brings together the cooperatives, the municipals, the independent power generators, the ISOs, RTOs, the Canadian electricity industry, because it is a North American grid, to work collaboratively on issues of critical infrastructure security and protection. So The way that I talk about this, first, some sort of foundational things, and I'll get into resilience a little bit more specifically. A little bit of eye candy for now. This is the threat landscape. This is something that, just to kind of give you perspective, we are looking at all hazards. And it's, cybersecurity, I think, got everybody's attention. We've been dealing with storms for years. There have actually been plenty of physical attacks and vandalism on the grid, some more notable than others. Think Metcalf out in California. What we're looking at is a framework of likelihood and consequence. And so all the way up in the very likely but very inconsequential is squirrels. And I think it can be a joke, but truthfully, right now there is a squirrel meeting his or her demise, and it has absolutely no impact on the grid. It's consequential to the squirrel, but not necessarily to our ability to operate the energy infrastructure. All the way down in the right corner, those really high consequence but really unlikely events, things like EMPs, things like nuclear war. This isn't to say that we as energy providers should be protecting the grid against nuclear war, but we are critical infrastructure. We are critical to the life, health, and safety of our customers. We are critical to national and economic security. And so we can't simply ignore that end of the spectrum. And I think resilience looks at, as you've heard throughout the themes from the previous two presenters, resilience really is trying to being consequence managers as opposed to trying to protect everything from everything all of the time. One easy way to put that is, if we've got to be right 100% of the time and the adversary has to be right once, we're going to fail. And so preparing for that failure and that ability to operate degraded, that ability to operate through an incident really is what resilience means to me and how we look at the broader threat landscape. Moving on from that, I'm going to talk about how the sector broadly approaches security and resilience. And again, you kind of heard it as this rubric of reliability versus resilience. You've got a couple hundred people on this call. I bet we have 300 different definitions of resilience. I don't really care about defining resilience per se, but I do like to at least have that framework of reliability is that ability to operate all the time. Resilience is that ability to take the punch. And how do we operate through abnormal conditions? And so some of the ways that we have protection, if you kind of look at the DHS framework of there's left of boom and right of boom. Left of boom, you're preparing, you're protecting, you're detecting, you're defending. And then right of boom, you're responding and you're recovering. And I think looking holistically at our obligations left of boom, but preparing for our obligations right of boom is a way to approach resilience and to develop a more resilient infrastructure. So one of the ways that we talk about that is 3 legs of a stool, right? If you have 2, you're going to fall over. 1, you're just balancing. So we've got 3 legs of a stool. The first is standards, and we have reliability standards, right? So there's that reliability versus resilience. I like the reliability standards. I like that we have a mandate for cyber and physical and operational security. It might be weird to hear a heavily regulated industry say we like our regulations, but they do provide that foundational level of protection. Now, I throw those aside really quickly by saying, great, we've got reliability standards. So if I do X, Y, and Z, I am secure, right? No, I'm complacent, and I have telegraphed my defenses to the adversary. So the easy way to put that is, if you make me put a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversary simply brings a 12-foot ladder. So I want to make them bring that 12-foot ladder, but I don't want to pretend like the standards themselves equate to resilience and security. So how do we get to resilience then, and how do we get to be more secure? That goes to those second 2 legs of the stool. The first there is industry-government partnership. What does that mean, right? Well, one embodiment of the industry-government partnership is the Sector Coordinating Council, and not just because I serve as the secretary for it, or part of the secretariat for it, but it is a unique structure that brings the highest levels of industry and the highest levels of government together. CEOs, senior government officials, working on issues of critical infrastructure protection and security. Now, even if CEOs were sitting in front of me, I would still say this: the CEOs are not the ones who do the work. Of course not. But They do provide resources. They do set priorities. They do create accountability. They are a draw to other senior executives. And so that CEO, senior government official partnership has been extraordinarily productive in the last 6, 7, 8 years at making improvements that industry and government can work more effectively together. Unity of effort and unity of message in how we work together, how we prepare for taking that punch that I keep referring to. So it breaks down, the partnership breaks down into effectively 4 buckets. The first is government industry coordination. Playbooks. How do we work together after boom? We don't want to be exchanging business cards on the tarmac. So that partnership, just the simple relationship development has been extraordinary. Second is threat information sharing, and this is true for both storms and security threats. Really having a better sense of what the impacts are likely to be, what the adversary is doing, what the weather is. As simple as that, having closer coordination and collaboration on sharing information about threats. The third is R&D. The way I put this is the government has some pretty cool toys, and we want those on our systems and helping to protect this critical infrastructure. And again, a lot of capabilities that the government brings to bear, but a lot of capabilities that the industry brings to bear. We are good at operating our system. The government has intelligence gathering capability. They have a standing army. They have a law enforcement mandate. How do we knit those responsibilities and roles together in as effective a way as possible? And then the last bucket is cross-sector coordination, something that's been talked about a little bit through the call so far. With respect to, everybody looks at the electricity sector as the most critical. And on a lot of levels we are, everybody relies on us. But we don't have water, we can't generate steam and cool our systems. We don't have telecommunications, can't operate. Don't have transportation and pipelines, can't move our fuel. Don't have financial services, no access to capital markets, can't trade our product. So again, this collaborative, it's not just industry and government working together, but it's east-west across critical infrastructure sectors. And the ESCC has been a very effective center of gravity to enable some of those improvements to our preparedness. Then, going to the last leg of the stool, it's what I said before. If we've got to be right 100% of the time, and the adversary or Mother Nature has to be right once, we've got to be preparing for right of boom. And you see the words there, grid resiliency, our mutual assistance programs, spare equipment programs, the ability to operate in a degraded state. I'll go into a little bit more detail on some of those things later, but again, sort of thinking of it holistically, having foundational standards, partnering closely with government to protect critical infrastructure, and then ultimately being prepared to respond and recover when the bad day comes. So now pictures, and I'm going to talk about these. I'm going to talk about resiliency in the framework of storms. So in addition to cyber and physical security, my group here helps with unity of effort and unity of message with respect to storm response. And the last couple of years have been extraordinary. I will go back to 2017 just for the purposes of this discussion, and different examples of resilience in Florida, in Texas, and in Puerto Rico. And the last one, my father, when I was growing up, always said, son, you've got 2 choices in life. You can be a role model or you can be a cautionary tale. And I would say Florida and Texas were the things of role model, and what we've learned out of Puerto Rico and the response there is cautionary tale, but something that we certainly can learn from. So, Florida. In 2005, they had a similar storm to Hurricane Irma that took more than 13 days for them to get 95% restored. During the intervening time, Florida was lucky enough to not have a lot of storms, no hurricanes that actually made landfall in more than a decade. During that time, there were investments made in storm hardening. There were investments made in processes and procedures. There was flood monitors put out in critical substations. There were wood poles replaced with concrete, steel, or composite. There were all sorts of preparations that they made for the inevitable next storm to hit. Well, in 2017, they got hit. They took that punch. The same type of storm, 4.5 million customers without power, that took them 5 days to get 95% recovered. So if you do, 6 days to get 95% recovered. So if you do that math, the GDP of the state of Florida is about $1 billion per day. During the 2005 to 2017 timeframe, they spent $3 billion on storm hardening efforts, and they shrunk the time that it took to restore from 13 days to 6. So $7 billion was saved. They spent $3 billion, net positive of $4 billion. really easy math. I'm not saying that it's a perfect one-for-one, but it gives an example of how some basic blocking and tackling and preparation can have really good returns on investment and better resiliency outcomes. Moving on to Texas, different form of resilience. 50 inches of rain, Hurricane Harvey, catastrophic flooding. At its max, 200,000 people without power in the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States. Again, extraordinary resilience and an ability to take a punch. They had good flood monitoring. They had the opportunity to bring spare equipment into theater. They had undergrounded a large portion of their system. Not a silver bullet, but particularly useful in that region. So examples of how you take a punch. Now you look at Puerto Rico, the sort of cautionary tale side of things. We sent crews there to help. And what we learned is they had not done any meaningful maintenance on that system in decades. They had no vegetation management rules. They didn't have a plan per se. They didn't have ICS, incident command structure. So when we went down there to help, the first thing we had to do was bring those basic incident response plans and procedures into theater so that we could more effectively respond and recover. That, instead of it being a week, and it was catastrophic, Hurricane Maria was, really devastated the island. No island could have been prepared for that sort of catastrophic of an incident, but it could have been better had we had basic maintenance, basic outage management system functionality, incident command structure, a plan in place, and better maintenance on the system. That would have shaved, what ended up being a 6-month plus restoration probably could have been reduced significantly. So that's the basic sort of viewpoint of resilience from EEI and me specifically, and how we're partnering with government. To talk about the report in a little bit more granularity, a couple of key themes that I think you've heard a little bit throughout the previous presenters, and some things that I want to suss out just a little bit more. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Duh. We're talking about a variety of threats. You go back to that first slide of squirrels to nation states. You're talking about different regions. What's happening in Florida and Texas in the Gulf Coast with impacts from hurricanes is going to be different, very different than what you see with regard to wildfires in the West, or what you're seeing with nor'easters and ice storms in other parts of the country. So thinking about this as regional issues, as more local issues, thinking about it in terms of how we work together between and among, and how we and consequence management. Right? It's not about eliminating risk, but it's about managing it. This goes to being threat agnostic. Those places, and I think Lauren hit it really well, so I won't belabor the point. But I think those places where we can have some no regrets investments that protect across several threat vectors, that is the most effective use of resources. That goes to those things like those degraded operations. How do we operate in a degraded state? Do we have spare equipment? What kinds of mutual assistance and now cyber mutual assistance capabilities do we need to bring to bear? Things like that. Something I call the technology paradox. We've talked a little bit about AMI and smart meters. We've talked a little bit about distributed energy resources, about how things like solar and storage can fit together. Those are all extraordinary capabilities, but the paradox is they also present a new threat vector. And one of the stories I tell about resilience in Puerto Rico, I've been there several times in the last 18 months or so. Every time I land, I look out as you land in San Juan, and all you see are blue tarps on top of roofs. You know what doesn't fit well on top of a blue tarp? Solar panels. Now, I'm not anti-solar by any stretch. My point here is we have to look at all of these tools, distributed resources, AMI, solar plus storage, other storage capabilities, in conjunction with the ability to defend those and to respond and recover should they be compromised. And a lot of that capability has been tested these last couple of years at storms for the electricity sector, and I would say the electricity sector has performed admirably given its role and responsibility as critical infrastructure providers. And then last is this need to be doing this in a risk-based way. Going back to that first slide, what is the most likely and consequential focusing our attention there. But also what I mean by risk-based is prioritization. And one of the things from a critical infrastructure perspective is, a security perspective, is that ability for the United States to, and our Canadian partners, to project force. So you deter adversaries two different ways. One of them is very much an industry responsibility. The attack does not have the intended impact. That is wholly on the private sector to engineer its system so that we can take a punch. Doing that, doing it better, and again, see the last several years of capability. The other way you deter is the attack has a consequence, and that is wholly the responsibility of government. Now, what we need to be able to do is prioritize defense installations, the ability to gather intelligence in warfight, so that an adversary who might think, I'm going to cripple a nation with a cyber or physical attack or some kind of a joint, combined attack, is going to think twice, because they're not going to hamper our ability to project force externally. And so that goes to that level of partnership between industry and government, and the responsibilities both bear as critical infrastructure providers to protect national security and the life, health, and safety of customers. So, like I said, slightly different take from more of a security perspective, but also informed by a lot of good work by this industry over the last couple of years with respect to storms, and the burgeoning partnership between industry and government that really is making us better prepared to deal with a lot of these threats. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Scott. And our last presenter is Rob Mork with the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. And following Rob's presentation, I'll moderate Q&A with our presenters. Rob?
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's an honor to be here on behalf of NASUCA. I've seen some questions in the comment field about some of who the other parties are, so I'll just briefly say that we're mostly state agencies who represent consumers across the U.S. Therefore, we have a lot of focus on state proceedings, but federal issues and regional issues have increasingly been part of what we're getting involved in. We are a very diverse set of offices. Let me advance the slide here. There are 55 of us in 43 states, restructured and vertically integrated, market, non-market, fossil fuels, renewables, east, west, north, south. So there are a lot of viewpoints that I'm trying to represent here. Our remarks were formed by a committee of us, trying to again reflect the diversity of what our members think, and I do want to include the usual disclaimers that the opinions expressed in our report are not necessarily those of NASUCA or any individual office, nor are they of my office here in Indiana. A lot of our focus is going to be on distribution, but I do want to make a few general remarks about generation and transmission. We are, of course, aware that there has been a great deal of discussion of generation and transmission, but we wanted to get a few things out on the table. Over time, as we go forward in the future and regionally, there's a great deal of variation again. This is a theme that you've heard before, that different speakers have talked about how individual states and regions may have different interests, and we think it's very true for generation issues. Transmission is also an issue. You can have all the generation in the world, but if you don't have transmission to deliver it, it doesn't do you a lot of good. So let's see, we want to talk about energy market design comes into some of these issues about generation and transmission. Many of us are very active in regional transmission organizations, and there's a lot of good work to be done there. Finally, as one of these issues, I want to mention cybersecurity. It's very important, and we would encourage those of you who are involved in cybersecurity issues to include us. There are some confidentiality issues there, but those can usually be worked out. And it's important to bring us along in any of these discussions so that we understand some of the puts and takes on why things are so expensive, or why is this approach better than another. It's easier for us to get comfortable with that if we've been in the discussions from the beginning. A little bit about definitions. We're running way late, so I'm going to keep this very short. we need to think about how we don't redo all that has already been done for reliability. Clearly, reliability is already addressing some of the issues that we want to address through resilience, through a resilience focus, but we don't want to overpay by engaging in belts and suspenders kind of approaches and failing to recognize what's already been done. Moving on to question 1. How much do we spend? That is near and dear to the hearts of consumers. We agree that one size does not fit all. In addition to avoiding the double pane problem that I just mentioned, we want to have some kind of analytical framework. We want to have, we've listed some approaches in our white paper, and I would encourage folks to take a look at those. We've tried to be sort of thoughtful about different starting points, but broadly we're talking about things that look at the probability events, the impact, very importantly to us, the cost-benefit analysis of different approaches and what that means to consumers. We'd like to develop some kinds of metrics, things to know that figure out if the money that's being spent is being spent well and if we're accomplishing what it is that we're trying to do. We'd also like to develop quantification of any savings that may result. And we'd love to work with those of you who are experts on these issues. We've always been impressed with the work that's done by the Berkeley Labs and others, so an open invitation to do that. Prioritizing is obviously important. I would like to focus a little bit on the role of trackers potentially in how some of these issues get paid for. Many of our members have had difficult experience with trackers because they tend to be sort of do the math exercises, which sometimes reduce our ability to get into the substance of analyzing things, and sometimes they end up being allowing utilities to recover rising costs automatically in lieu of coming in for rate cases where we can look more broadly at what utilities are doing. So we're open to approaches, but we do have a sensitivity there. Question 2, who is responsible? We've listed some of the entities here. We agree states have a major role, that these are first and foremost issues that exist sort of at the state level, but there are regional aspects too, as we've talked about. And all of those levels may vary. Different states, different regions have different interests, so we don't think that there should be a one-size-fits-all. We do think that there's a role for federal agencies, regional entities, and so we want to encourage that they be included as well. Question 3, what investments are most impactful? For us, a lot of the focus should be on distribution. We have some charts in our paper that talk a little bit about that being where many of the issues are. One of the bread and butter sort of issues that we see being helpful is vegetation management. And I think that I'm going to move on from here in the interest of time. Question 4, how proactive? The answer to any question about being proactive is almost always yes, but we need to take into account how hard it is to predict some of these things. We're talking by its very nature about things that are unexpected. We want to think about things besides shiny new gadgets, things like workforce turnover, supply chain issues, and as always, it's my job to say cost-benefit analysis as many times as possible. I've heard all the other speakers talk about it a little bit too, so I'm glad that we're all at least talking the same language, but it is very important to us. Finally, question 5. How to improve decision-making about resilience involving a range of stakeholders is very important. Again, we like the idea of developing analytical frameworks and metrics. Having a really more thoughtfully integrated distribution planning set of approaches seems like an obvious thing that we can maybe make some progress on. I'm not going to say cost-benefit analysis again, but again, important. The last 2 slides are just kind of a summary of our principal issues, so I won't go through those in detail. But I would like to underline our closing comment on the last slide about how we would very much enjoy working with the DOE, its national laboratories, and other stakeholders on these issues, and analytical frameworks and evaluation metrics. So with that, I will hand it back to Lisa, and thanks again for being on the program, and let's go to Q&A.
Rob, thanks so much for helping us make up time too. So we now have about 20 minutes to take care of questions. We've got some excellent questions in for the chat box. So Rob, as a reward for helping us make up some time, I'm going to start on the first question with your response to a question about how do you draw funds for improving resilience? How do you draw funds from outside the utilities sector? So it's not just customer-funded, utility investments. So this is a strategic question, really, with implications, either from, the public funds or from, private sector funds as well. Let's start with response from you on this, Rob.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I think part of it is that we, whenever you're asking somebody for money, it always helps to have them involved in the process so that they are there sort of thinking through what the issues are and they can be educated about what their interests are. So I don't have very specific thoughts about exactly how we do this in each instance, but I think that starting with a broad-based stakeholder process is where you begin.
And Scott, do you want to give a response to that as well?
Can you repeat the question, Lauren?
Yeah, sure. It's Lisa. The question is about how do you draw in additional funds from outside the utility sector to help, where appropriate, cover investments in resilience? So whether it's public funding or it's private sector funding beyond the utility sector. Should you do that? How do you do that? Is it important?
Yeah, no, so we absolutely should, and I guess I would talk about it, there's sort of three ways that you can fund things. One of them is rate-based, and if it's something that is for the benefit of all the customers, great. The other, another way that you can do it is customers specifically, and what I mean by that is, for example, the Department of Defense. If they have a unique resilience need, that is something that companies can certainly enable, working in partnership with DoD or other critical customers, and there are ways to then bring their funding in. And then the last is markets, and what I mean by markets is not just ISOs and RTOs and kind of pricing in the value of resilience, but markets kind of driving changes if the community, if a group of stakeholders wants something that's more resilient, that can kind of drive change in the industry. And so I think looking at it holistically, let's look at the particular project, let's look at the particular value of it, and then let's be creative about the different ways that we finance it. I think are all sort of reasonable ways to get at more cost-effective investment in resilience.
I'm gonna jump to another question here because I think it's related. We got a question in the door about how does all of this discussion today and in the published report online, how does this tie into the business community, particularly with respect to their continuity planning? And there was a reference to the Association of Contingency Planners around that. Scott, I don't know if you have a response to that.
Yeah, I can hit that a little bit. I would say that business continuity is a subset of broader system resilience. I think an individual company's ability to operate, to keep its own lights on, to do its own business, is something that there is a lot of science and experience behind. So business continuity is a subset. Broader system resilience, you might not necessarily need everybody to be able to be fully prepared for business continuity, as long as you can keep some of the fundamental foundational things that you need to support national security or life and safety. So I think of them, like I said, I think of it as a subset, but I think it's an important subset given, again, a lot of the science and experience behind developing business continuity plans.
All right, thanks. Let's move on to another question. Lauren, I'm going to start with you on this one. You talked about, as did really all of the speakers, the definitions of resilience versus reliability are not necessarily very clear. And so, this question sort of logically follows, how would utilities distinguish between these two types of investments? Do you think that's important from a ratepayer's perspective? Which one might be more important, or are they equally important? And I'd like to get several perspectives on this. Let's start with Lauren.
Thanks, Lisa. So the regulators indicated that the primary difference is frequency and magnitude of the event. And so that would flow through the risk-based analysis that you were doing for any proposed investments for resilience. And obviously, if some of the states didn't distinguish between resilience and reliability, so they would just stop with that answer. Yeah, I think let me just stick with frequency and magnitude of the event to ensure I'm sticking with what the regulators discussed.
Okay, Randy, do you want to jump in here on that question?
Sure. I should just to clarify. I mean, cooperatives are in a few states are regulated by state regulators, and therefore, like an investor-owned utility, would be subject to prudence review and other reviews like an investor-owned utility in their resilience and reliability investments, and so. There really would be no difference there. In the majority of the states, cooperatives are sometimes described as self-regulated. They're actually regulated through by their own elected boards under state law, and therefore they're regulated really by the ballot box. And so the cooperatives are responsible directly to their members for justifying these decisions. And from my own perspective, that makes the resilience versus reliability a little less important. If there are reliability standards, whether NERC or imposed by a state, the co-op would have to comply with those, of course. Enhancing resilience then would the investment then would have to be justified to the membership as being in their interest. And I would also pick up on something Scott mentioned in his answer to one of the previous questions, and that is if there are particular reliability or resilience needs by a particular customer, say an industrial customer or a Defense Department installation that's served by a co-op, then arrangements can be made for that the cost to be directly assigned to that member, and therefore and not rolled into the general rates of the entire cooperative. So those kinds of cost allocation questions can be important when we talk about these kinds of resilience investments.
Scott, do you want to weigh in here on how important it is for utilities to distinguish between resilience versus reliability, and which might be more important? Maybe from the utility's perspective, the question was really about what's more important from the ratepayer's perspective, or are they really equally important? How do they relate?
Yeah, it's a tough one to answer. I mean, they're equally important, but for different reasons. I think reliability, again, to that sort of not weak definition, but sort of that high-level definition that we're operating under. Reliability is operating in normal states. Resilience is the ability to operate, in abnormal conditions. Reliability is when 99.99% of the time we're not dealing with some sort of impact to the system. And so I would say, because it's 99.99% of the time, well, gosh, that has to be the priority. But that other 0.01%, well, that could really mean long-term outages. That could really mean an impact to customer safety. That could mean impact to national security and whatever, financial impacts, et cetera. So I do think that thinking about reliability in a more holistic way that also sort of drives toward resilient outcomes, in both blue skies and when we're dealing with events, is important. How you fund that, how you do it in a cost-effective way, how you do it so that it's not gold plating against every conceivable threat, but gives you some modicum of comfort that we're going to be able to, if not withstand the punch, certainly be able to get back to normal operations as quickly as possible. So I can't think of one as more important than the other, but you do have to consider them slightly differently just because the cost-benefit ratio is skewed when you're talking about unlikely or infrequent events.
And Rob,
hey, Lisa, can I jump?
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Yeah, and thinking back about how Lauren talked about, some state commissions see resilience already as being part of reliability, and at the very least, I think that a lot of us see that there's a significant amount of overlap between the two. So it's hard to say exactly what our group thinks of it all as a group, but it seemed like a lot of the things that we're talking about in resilience are things that are threats that are out there, but that haven't been fully sort of appreciated and planned for as part of the reliability process. So it seems to me, given that overlap, and maybe even more importantly, given that in order to do things efficiently and making sure that you're not sort of overlapping with belts and suspenders, it seems like you need to think about these things together as you're planning how to most effectively and reliably operate the system given a whole range of threats. So to me, I think to our group, it's important that we think of them together to some degree in order to avoid double paying kinds of situations.
Thanks. Let's move on. We've had a couple of questions on the topic of prioritization. So first, what mechanisms can be used to determine resilience priorities? People, have used things like weighted variables. Are there any analyses or tools that can help utilities and other entities prioritize investments in grid resilience? People refer to also risk profiles, characteristics of the decision maker, what level it's at, transmission, distribution, et cetera. So this is all about, any guidance you can provide on prioritization and the sort of state of affairs on that. Maybe let's start with Scott on this.
I was hoping you wouldn't start with me. I'm a little out of my depth with respect to the kinds of tools that inform it. We have a tendency to look at the squeakiest wheel. And look, for those who are not aware, the Electric Power Research Institute just this morning released a report on EMP. And we, the sector coordinating council, are very much behind the work that they're doing because their sound science will help inform sound investments and sound policy decisions with respect to a very unlikely but very high impact potential event. And so that has been because policymakers have been really concerned about EMP. Was that the right thing for the industry to spend a lot of time and resources on? I don't know, because I don't know how likely that particular threat vector is. But if some of the science that comes out of that also helps with geomagnetic disturbances and a stronger equipment sharing regime and better, more resilient communications capabilities so that we can operate following an EMP, well, then it was kind of a no-regret set of investments and dedication of resources. So I can't answer the how do we best sort of identify where we ought to be spending our attention, except to say some of it's going to be driven simply by policymakers, some of it's going to be driven by intelligence, big intelligence, the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, and some of it's going to be driven by the various regional specific threats that everybody in a particular region knows that they are susceptible to. And I think some sort of convergence of all of that, if there's a good scientific way to do it, like I said, I'm out of my depth on that, but from a qualitative perspective, that's how it's being driven right now.
All right, I should just chime in here that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has developed some tools and also some materials underway, so you can always reach out to me and I can put you in touch with the right people. So anybody else want to jump in quickly on this? Otherwise, I want to move to another question here.
Sure. It's Lauren, I just want to, I'll jump in very quickly. So I think there's two different approaches, which Scott got to. But the number one is a data-driven analysis. And there are a number of entities already doing that. Your emergency management departments in states, for instance, should have some information on the probability of different events and what are the largest threats for your state. I know the military is also doing some work in this area. So the first is to collect the data that's available concerning the threats in your area, and then the second would be to take that data and a large stakeholder base will need to evaluate for that specific state what their priorities are. So it's not going to be data alone. It's going to be both quantitative and qualitative.
All right, we only have about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to try to, let's answer some questions kind of in rapid fire if we can. So first, I wanted to ask you all who are interested in responding about the role of integrated resource planning, at least vertically integrated states, to evaluate potential investments in resilience to minimize long-term cost and avoid stranded investments. Randy, I'm going to start with you because NRECA did mention that in its essay for the report.
Yes, from our perspective, that's really the way the co-ops operate through long-term planning processes, integrated resource planning. Co-ops remain, for the most part, vertically integrated, and that is a key part. We're very interested in the outcome of the NARUC's effort at integrated distribution resource planning, incorporating DERs into the overall integrated resource planning process.
Well, let me also sort of tag on a related question then. NARUC just published a report on the value of resilience for distributed energy resources, and so anybody else want to jump in here on the topic of using integrated resource planning to help evaluate some of these potential utility investments in resilience, and also particularly with respect to the role of distributed energy resources?
So this is Scott. I'll spike in real quickly. We also mentioned integrated resource planning as important, looking at the system holistically and then leveraging all of the different capabilities and redundancies and that enable resilience. So that's important. One just sort of side issue related to that that we're seeing in a lot of different places is sharing of sensitive resource planning information in public ways can be counterproductive because while resource planners and state commissions and everybody else and the distributed resource providers, for example, are all looking at this, so is the adversary. And so finding a way to do this in a secure, thoughtful way is going to be critical to success of integrated resource planning.
Anybody else have thoughts on this? Because I want to jump into at least one more question.
Yeah, this is Randy from NRECA. I've looked quickly at the NARUC report, but I haven't got to discuss it with our engineers who really know this stuff. But we are concerned about the new threats posed by DERs on co-op distribution grids, but also recognizing they can provide great benefits if properly deployed and used. And so it's a key thing that we're looking at right now is how best to use those for the benefit of all of our members.
Great, thanks. Let's move on to another. Okay, go ahead quickly.
Sorry, I'll make it very fast. This is Rob for the Consumer Advocates. Yeah, we'd be very supportive of that too. There are some issues about how you do it across state lines. Some coordination between states makes sense. I'll leave it at that.
All right, great. Well, actually, this is a great segue into the question I'm going to ask next. In terms of cooperation, are there any efforts, particularly among the utilities, across utilities, to track the effectiveness of the investments utilities have already made in resilience so that other utilities can use the results for their cost-benefit analysis? This is a classic evaluation and verification and measurement question. Are you using results to improve things going forward? So, question for Scott and Randy.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this, Scott. I would just say yes. it's happening certainly within EEI and its membership. This is something that we always sort of share best practices about what's working, what doesn't. And I go back to my anecdote about Florida. It's a very quantifiable benefit to $3 billion in investment that ultimately saved $7 billion worth of GDP for the state of Florida. So they're not all that kind of cut and dry, but I do think that finding quantitative and qualitative ways to demonstrate resilience does help to enable future resilience investments.
Yeah, and for the co-ops, I'd have a similar answer. We have got research underway in which we're trying to develop case studies and provide information on best practices and ideas so the co-ops can learn from one another and from experience. And I noted in the report one example of a open source modeling software being developed to use in evaluating investments on distribution grids.
I'm going to try to sneak in one last question, even though it's really the top of the hour. We said we close up here, but I wanted to ask and follow up on one of the responses. Scott, you talk in the report in your presentation about information is sharing, robust information sharing is really important. But how do you resolve the tension between that information sharing and protecting information to preserve cyber and physical security?
Yeah, you hit it on the head. There's a tension there, and I think there are different states that have done it really effectively. Some have taken a reading room approach where the commission will allow an entity to come in, describe some of their security threats, some of the things that they're doing to protect their systems, but never actually turn over the data and then go bring all that information away. So that's one example. There are other ways to deal with this. There are ways to anonymize certain pieces of data that make it a little bit less valuable to the adversary. But yeah, look, we've got this tension of the value of sunshine. We've got this tension about the value of sharing information for the benefit of all, system planning, integrated planning, things like that. But we also have to do it knowing that critical infrastructure is a target and the adversary isn't stupid. And so just managing that tension and working collaboratively between and among the regulators, the state consumer advocates, the entities, the customers is critical. I wish I had a simple answer.
No, that's great. Rob, do you have any response to that or any additional reflections from a consumer perspective?
Not a lot. I think that some of the people worry about some of the confidentialities with respect to state agencies, but those can be worked out. Scott mentioned a reading room sort of approach, so we're happy to try to work with people on those kinds of issues.
All right, I'm going to sneak in one more question because there's so many good questions here. But Lauren, let's start with you. What type of state public utility commission proceedings do you think are most effective at improving resilience of electricity systems, kind of outside rate cases? You discussed in your presentation and the report targeted measures versus broad initiatives that states in the MISO footprint have taken. But when you sort of raise it up beyond just that footprint, just generally, what kinds of proceedings or activities can state public utility commissions conduct that you think are most effective outside of rate cases?
Well, we raised in the report both generic dockets and rulemaking. So I'm going to try to stay as closely tied to the report as I can. The commissions indicated, and some gave examples of their commissions essentially starting generic dockets, coming up with guidelines, or not quite quantitative standards, but goalposts that they wanted their utilities to meet. And that's a perfect example of something outside of a rate case where you can give your utilities guidance without being prescriptive. I think that's probably good.
Okay, great. Any other reflections on that question? All right. Well, let's wrap it up here then. Thanks so much for staying a few extra minutes. We have another report coming up in the series, report number 12 on utility options for their large customers like corporations and cities, on renewable energy options. And we've got Walmart participating, Xcel Energy, and the World Resources Institute. So that report is coming up next. So we will be back to you soon with a new report and a new webinar. And until then, You can find the materials for this webinar. A recording will be posted in a few days. The slides are already there and the report at the website shown. So thanks everybody for joining, and thanks very much to our authors and our presenters today.